Hi there! Are you experiencing issues when rendering your project in DaVinci Resolve and you couldn't find any helpful resource online, on YouTube or in communities? I got you, because I've been there. I'm Mirko, an independent filmmaker, and with my last short film, I ran into massive issues in the rendering process. In this video, I'll share my experience how to solve computer crashes when rendering your project, showing you the optimal settings in DaVinci Resolve and different methods you can try to export the project you've been working on for so long. Let's jump into it. The recent short film I produced is just 10 minutes long, but it took me a month to render, trying different methods in order to get the job done. The issue was caused by a few effects that I applied in the color page that were so heavy that they couldn't be rendered out right away. In this short film, there are a few of those clips that caused those issues. My MacBook was crashing several times, the fans went crazy, and it took me a lot of effort to find a way to fix that problem. Some open effects you can apply are just a click, but they can cause massive problems for your system. Effects like film grain, glowing, halation, and even color space transform effect was heavy on my system. I've got a 2019 MacBook Pro with the i7 chip, 32 GB of RAM, and the biggest GPU configuration. But that was not enough for this project. You might be wondering now how I actually did it, with a system that kept crashing. There are a few things you can do to optimize your system, tweaking the settings in Resolve to ensure that everything is set up correctly. This won't fix the issue though, but it will optimize the way Resolve works and reacts in certain situations. Let's go through the settings together now. Go to the settings of Resolve in the menu bar. In the UI settings, check the 2 menu points to prevent Resolve from stopping the render when experiencing difficulties. Points to check are Stop playback when dropped frame is detected and Stop renders when a frame or clip cannot be processed. Next up, go to the Memory and GPU tab. Make sure to give Resolve as many resources as possible by increasing the memory and selecting your dedicated GPU. The GPU processing mode can also make a difference. These are the general settings in Resolve. You have to set them only once and restart Resolve. The following settings are now project specific and you have to set them for each project. Go to the Export tab. The setting I show you now is turning off the preview during the render. Normally, while Resolve is rendering, you can see the film playing in real time in the preview monitor. This requires some extra processing power, so disable that by clicking on 3 dots next to render queue. Hover over updates during render and turn this option off. In addition to that, to further save resources, you can also minimize the entire program during the rendering and leave your computer alone for that time. Trust me, I've been there. I just wanted to look at the file while Resolve was rendering in the background and it crashed because of that. So leave your computer alone for that time. I reckon you don't want to be bothered either when you work on something with all your intention. Next is a very crucial point where you can determine how much stress your system is going to be exposed to. For that, don't choose any preset but go with the custom export in the Export tab. If you click on the point File, you can tell Resolve to not render at maximum speed, which is the standard setting. By choosing a lower percentage, your system won't be forced to use all resources and render at fullest speed. Slow it down to give your system more time to process and render your project. The final render will take much longer, but it might not crash at all. In most cases, that solves a lot of rendering issues already, but not in my case. No matter how low the setting was, it still kept crashing. The last tip I give you in terms of the settings is to go to the advanced render settings. In the same custom export menu under video, you can choose use render cached images if you have cached clips beforehand. Resolve then uses the clips that have been cached and only does the encoding for the final export of those clips. If you haven't cached anything, you can ignore this option. Method 1. Render in place. The first actual method to render your project is to use render in place. What it does is, in a nutshell, it renders the clip you're selected in your timeline with all the effects applied. This method then replaces the original clip in the timeline with the rendered version, where the effects are baked in. To render a clip in place, right-click on the clip, render in place, Choose the format, in my case QuickTime with the Apple ProRes codec. Include video effects, fusion compositions, color grading effects according to your needs, and then click Render. Select the location where the new clips shall be stored. Don't worry, the original clip and adjustments aren't lost. You can go back anytime, right click and then going on Decompose in place. Instead of rendering each clip by itself, you can also create a compound clip and render that one out. A compound clip is basically a kind of separate timeline itself that contains the clips you selected. You can access the compound clip like any other timeline in Resolve. Select all your clips, right click, select New Compound Clip at the very top of the drop-down menu. Name your compound clip accordingly, then click Create. Now you can follow the procedure I mentioned to render this compound clip in place. When you rendered the critical clips that caused your computer to crash, you can then render the entire project as usual. I used that method partially, and thanks to that method I was able to export my project. The second method is render your video as image sequence. So what is film exactly? It's a sequence of stills images played after another to create the illusion of motion, the so-called motion picture. In the realm of traditional cinema, it means 24 frames per second, or in other words, 24 still images per second. The next method I'll show you was the key to render out my short film, the camera. Create a compound clip of your timeline. Go into the Fusion page, press Shift and Space to open the search bar and type in Saver. Change the settings in the inspector accordingly. Select a location to save the image sequence. Confirm the error message if it appears. Go back to the inspector and change the file extension to PNG or the file format you've chosen prior. In the menu bar of DaVinci, in the Fusion tab, click Export All Saver. The big advantage of this method is that it renders each frame as a separate image file, so that if Resolve crashes for a reason, you won't lose progress, because the images are still saved on your drive. I still had a couple of crashes during that method, and I imported the stills images into the timeline so I knew exactly where it crashed and started from there again. This method isn't the fastest either, but it's the safest. When your computer crashes during the render in place method, all progress is gone, but not with this image sequence method. In the next step, I'll show you how to import the stills images as a sequence back in your timeline, so you turn the stills into a motion picture again. Go to the Media tab, in the top middle of the screen, right before the viewer window begins. Click the three dots over there. Hover over Frame Display Mode and select Sequence. Drag and drop your images into the media pool. Drag the image sequence into your timeline. Now you've basically got the same result as you had with the previous method, with the difference that you couldn't keep the audio. But for that, you surely have a copy of the original audio track or the original clip in your timeline. Third method is pre-render fusion clips and color adjustments. Let's talk about caching. There are a few different kinds of caching. As in every professional editing program, there's the timeline cache, where the entire timeline is cached with all clips, adjustments and effects. For this scenario, it's not applicable. We do not want Resolve to smart render the entire timeline. What I'd like to show you is a way to cache fusion effects and color adjustments for each single clip individually. This can help you later on to render your project while the most critical parts with the most effects are already cached, and with this method you can cache the effects separate without pre-rendering the clip itself, which saves resources and space on your hard drive. Right-click on the clip in your timeline. Select either Render Cache Fusion Output or Render Cache Color Output. Remember that this method is going to cache all effects you apply to the selected clip, but there's a way to cache one specific effect separate from all other effects. This can further help you narrow down the problematic effects in your project. For that, go to the Color tab. The red marked nodes mean that they were not cached and might cause issues when playing back in real time. Click right on the node and select Node Cache and say on. Resolve is now forced to cache this specific node. At this point, it's important to notice that you should not make any changes to the node beforehand. Otherwise, you would have to cache again. This is due to the node structure of Resolve. The fourth method I would like to show you is effects stacking and render stacking. Another option to render the sequences that cause issues is to render the clip with a few effects applied and using render in place and putting the other effects on top after you pre-rendered them. Then apply another effect, render that in place again, and so on. So you have all the effects rendered out. That way you embed the effects to the clip and stack effect after effect on top. Method 5. Splitting your timeline. One of my first attempts to render my short film was to cut the timeline in multiple pieces, render them out, and put the pieces back together for a final render. But as you might guess, this wasn't really a helpful option, but it would be an option for a different problem maybe. That's why I mentioned it at this point, to give you as many options as possible to render your project. If none of the above helped, if you followed through and tried the methods I mentioned but still experienced issues, congrats. Your problem is even tougher than my project was. But don't worry, there are still 2 options, so don't give up just yet. A last option would be getting an eGPU. This is a normal graphics card with an enclosure that you can plug into your computer to boost graphics performance. But there's a catch for Mac users with Apple Silicon, because it simply doesn't work due to the architecture of Apple chips. I tried this method as well, but there must have been something wrong with the enclosure, so the GPU didn't properly show up in the system. And I tried 2 different GPUs, but they still did not show up. I dropped this option quickly and sent the parts back. This is when I discovered the solution that worked for my project, which is render in place and image sequence in combination. Other than investing in an eGPU would be outsourcing the final render. There are companies that offer their computing power for such specific cases for a certain fee. At that point, you probably have to rethink if that's really worth it. Especially for non-budget productions, this can mean an end. To wrap this up, the methods that worked in my case with effects like halation, glow, and film grain on some of the clips could only be rendered by using the render as image sequence first and in combination with render in place for the parts where the image sequence still failed and caused a crash of Resolve. After the pre-render with those 2 methods, it still took me more than 8 hours to render the final film. This was a real journey, and although it cost me many nerves, the end result and positive feedback we received for this short film was worth the effort. Filmmaking is all about problem solving, and that doesn't end with the production, but with the final export of your project. I want to encourage you to keep going, because you never know where this might lead you. Maybe the project you're currently working on is a breakthrough in your career. You'll never know if you quit and give up on the project that troubles you. Keep going. I believe you can do this. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments down below so I can help you where I can. Like and subscribe to help other filmmakers and creative professionals who struggle. Thanks for listening and good luck for your project, and keep creating.